Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of My Future Energy Career. My name is Jalen, and I am joined today by our STEM hero, Allison Leggett. Welcome, Allison.
Hi, hello everyone. It's so lovely to be here and to meet everyone. My name is Allison Wilson Leggett, and my title is University Administrator. So I'm looking forward to recognizing the events that led me to a STEM career and that will lead you and promote you to be a STEM hero.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your introduction, Allison. And without further ado, I will hand it off to you, and you can get started with talking about your career.
Okay, absolutely. So, as a university administrator, I serve as a visionary. I facilitate learners in attaining their dreams through advanced education. So, you might think, well, what do you mean advanced education? Isn't being in middle school or high school enough? Well, we hope that after middle school, you go on to high school, and after high school, you go on to college. But don't just get and stop at an associate degree, even though you can do a lot with that. And don't just stop with a bachelor's degree. You can do a lot with that as well. But go on beyond your heart's desire and get a master's degree, even get two master's degrees, and go beyond that and get a doctoral degree. A doctoral degree is called a terminal degree. That means that there are few others in the whole nation and in the world that have that degree. So make a promise to yourself that you will be unique in attaining advanced education.
Thank you for sharing about that. And now we'll move on to some of your hobbies.
Oh gosh, I love talking about my hobbies because I do work a lot and I do put a lot of time into my work. I love the hobbies that I have. I would say, as far back as I can remember, I absolutely loved amusement park rides. Why did I love them? I think because of the thrill, the excitement. Now, I didn't like waiting in long lines, but what I did like was the thrill and the speed. I think I was addicted a little bit to speed. So if you see in the picture, there is a roller coaster ride, of course. Being raised in Southern California, I was quite familiar growing up with Disneyland rides, Magic Mountain rides, and I think my favorite though was Knott's Berry Farm. And partly also because of the history behind Knott's Berry Farm with the fruit trees and all of that. So I had like a special attention to Knott's Berry Farm. But in loving amusement park rides, I also share, if I wasn't able to go to those parks, I love simple things like roller skate riding. I absolutely love doing that. For some reason, I was self-taught in ice skating as well. I never had a lesson, but I'm able to ice skate. And I love driving race cars. You might wonder, well, how could a STEM educator love driving race cars? And what type of race cars could those be? Well, the race cars that I'm talking about are actually limited to those that are at amusement parks. So don't get your hopes up that I'm a NASCAR rider, but I absolutely love driving race cars. Beyond the simple bumper cars, I love competition. So if you take a look at least three of those in terms of my hobbies, they all deal with speed and being first.
Yeah, I love how your hobbies are a reflection of who you are as a person. Very driven, very motivated. I love it. But yeah, thank you for sharing about that. And next we will go into a little bit of physics.
Thinking about speed, you might think about, were there some scientists that came up with laws of motion? So a little history lesson brings you back to Newton. And you might be familiar with Newton's famous laws. The first law is that a body in motion stays in motion and a body at rest stays at rest. Now think about the roller coaster ride for a moment. You know that you have to either have a lever in your lap or a seatbelt. And the purpose of that seatbelt or the lever in your lap is to recognize that if you are in motion and the roller coaster slows down, then you're going to still be in motion unless you're held back. Or if you're at rest, you're going to stay at rest unless something secondarily acts upon it. And looking at the second law, it's a calculation that mass times acceleration equals a force. When I think about the smaller bumper card rides, there is a mass of the bumper car and it goes at a certain speed. And as that speed changes or the velocity changes, that turns into acceleration. Simply think about the more something weighs and the faster that it goes, there's more force. So in a simple case of a bumper car, the bigger my bumper car is, the more force I can put anytime I bump something else. Really fascinating for me to think about those laws and think about diving deep into why I loved motion so much. And for the third law, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And the simplest ways to think about those are reflexes. So sometimes if you're on a scary ride, some reflexes are that your heart is going to race really fast, or for some, it's an automatic scream. But Newton's third law really reflects how logical it is that an object that might be sitting gets pushed, it's actually going to push back. As you are sitting in your seat and gravity is pushing down, there's a force that's pushing right back up because that's what's keeping you level. If the forces were different, you and I would be crashing to the ground, or we would be constantly pushed up. So something to think about with physics.
Awesome. Thank you for that little mini crash course on physics, and hopefully inspired some kids to start looking into physics on their own time. Thank you for sharing, and we'll go into a little bit more about Newton's law.
So in this demonstration, looking at an object at rest, staying at rest, in the first case, you have a driver and they're in their car, but suddenly they run into a brick wall. Well, if they don't have on a seatbelt, they're going to continue to go at the same speed at the initial impact, at the exact same speed. So this is why it's so very important if you're on your bicycle or you're riding in a car to have on that seatbelt. On a bicycle, have a helmet on because if you run into something, you're going to keep flying. Your bicycle will stop, but you will keep flying. And in the second case, looking at that truck, it is putting a force on the car. And unfortunately, sometimes that ends up having a lot of damage to the car. An object in motion will stay in motion with the same rate and at the same direction unless acted upon by an unbalanced outside force. So I'd like you to think about this for a moment. If a truck moving at a certain speed is running into that car, the only reason for that car not to move is that it is reflecting in a reverse motion at the same force. So either it's going really, really fast with a small mass, or it has a very high mass going at a regular speed. So somehow that force that equals the mass times acceleration must equal for them not to move. If it were not equal, then one of the two will definitely move.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for the information. I feel like physics can be sometimes a hard concept to explain, but I love the way you're explaining it. And I love the graphics you listed here. No one wants to end up like our friend on the motorcycle up here. But yeah, thank you for sharing. And next we'll go into your career as a NASA scientist.
Okay, my exciting part of my career. So one day in high school, my college counselor told me to go to El Segundo, California for a job. I happened to be at a school that was not necessarily college focused. There were many of my classmates that looked at going into what we call blue collar jobs, maybe working in fast food restaurants, even though that is a job, it is a worthy income, and one can gain management skills and learn how to budget and actually do quite well in owning a business. However, I had other things in mind. I didn't see of myself as a business owner. I thought of myself more in performing academically. And I believe my college counselor thought about that in the same way. So wouldn't you know that that college counselor directed me to a job at NASA. And as you can probably imagine, there were various levels of security. I needed to identify who I was. They had to call to verify that I was coming down. And I went through several security checkpoints. They did all kinds of scans to get me in. And this was just for the interview. They asked me questions about math and science, which I could clearly say because I really like math and science. I didn't know at that time that I was good at math and science. I just knew that I liked it. And sometimes when you find something you like, you really become really good at, and others will notice. And if others don't notice, let them know that you like math and science or you like history, and which is another element of math and science. Understanding the history behind math and science is also a talent. So I went to the interview. They said, wonderful, you will get started working in science and mathematics. I did not know exactly what that meant because I was just a young teen at the time. So I was connected with some NASA scientists, and the first thing was they asked me a lot of questions because, of course, I was the youngest person there. They said, well, what are your interests? What do you want to do when you grow up? And at that time, I said, well, I have a family member, my mother, who has a terminal disease. And what I'd like to do is find a cure. That was the only answer that I had as a child, that I wanted to find a cure for my mother. My mother was ill, and I wanted to find a cure for her. And they said, well, that's what science can do. Working as a research scientist can lead to cures for diseases. So I said, well, that's what I want to do then. I want to be the person that will cure my mother. So in the NASA department or division of physical and chemical studies, they don't deal directly with curing diseases. What they did do, though, was deal directly with various divisions of anything dealing with rockets, let's say. There are limits to what I can share, so I will only share that I worked with rocket fuels. You see, when you work at NASA and government agencies, you are screened. There's various levels of being screened. And there is information that you can share, and there's information that you cannot share. And that's because as a government employee, you are secured. So you're protected and you're secured with your knowledge. But I can say, as I said, I work with rocket fuels. And you might wonder, well, rocket fuels, what are they? Well, think about gasoline. Well, nowadays, there's more than just gasoline that runs your cars. There's electricity that can run your cars. And of course, there's ethanol that's used. There are some hydrogen vehicles that are out there as well. But traditionally, people think of gasoline. And a few years ago, there was something called diesel fuel. And you think about diesel fuel, think about some trucks and very, very noisy engines and very, very black smoke. Well, that's diesel fuel. So think of rocket fuels as being that. And also think about if you've ever gone to a gas station and you see your parents pump gas and you notice there are some fumes that come out of the hose, and you wonder, what are those fumes? Well, that's because rocket fuels, as well as gasoline and other fuels, can actually vaporize easily. And so that's why they're under very, very high pressures. So if you can imagine the Earth, we're under what's called 1 atmospheric pressure, which is 760 millimeters of mercury. But when you go to outer space, it's less pressure. That's why astronauts are bumping around a lot, right? So we have to make sure that the rocket fuel that we have can still be in the liquid state out there in the atmosphere. That's one concern, of course, that we have. Another bigger concern that we have, of course, is that would we want to be going to outer space and run out of fuel? Or do we want to go into outer space and have too much fuel? So all of these things kind of go into play in thinking about rocket fuel. And then also thinking about other petroleum elements, such as the oil and grease that go on the ball bearings of the rocket ship itself. So things dealing with the petroleum products I studied to make sure that when these rockets did go into outer space, they would function just as well as they would do on Earth. Years and years of thought goes into that. It's not just, okay, whatever works on Earth is going to work in outer space. So a lot of things that happen with that. So I did that for one summer, and I kept coming back summer after summer after summer. And every year I learned new things. So that is where I go on to the next slide and talk about more on the rocket fuels and burning the fastest. We don't want them to burn too fast. You don't want them getting halfway to the moon and dropping back down to Earth. So we ask about inhibitors that are used. Inhibitors that were used a couple of decades ago contained lead. And if you ever heard about lead, you may have think of some negative things about lead. And there are a few negative things. One positive thing is that it did inhibit. It did what we mean slow down the burning of rocket fuel. I say that slowly to have you think about this. You don't want the rocket fuel to burn quickly and you're done and you have to land back to Earth. You want it to kind of pace itself where it makes it all the way to the moon. And guess what? All the way back. You don't want it to burn out. And you don't want it to catch on fire either. You want it to kind of be a slow burn. Think about anytime you have a barbecue and you have the charcoal briskets that are sitting there. You don't want them burning out after just grilling some vegetables, right? You don't want your parents to put more fuel in every time you cook something. So you want it to kind of burn a little bit slowly. And then also think about how to track that flow. How would you track it? And we track it actually using what's called isotopes. Isotopes give off radiation, and that allows scientists to see, oh, okay, this has burned a little bit faster than this one. So we don't use what's called normal carbon, but we use radioactive carbon. So normal carbon has an atomic mass of 12, radioactive carbon has an atomic mass of 14. So we try to use that and try to track this radioactivity of that. And then we ask ourselves, what is rocket fuel, and can rocket fuel be replaced by something that's a little bit more safe? Think about that.
Well, this is extremely interesting information. And I actually wanted to ask you a follow-up question about rocket fuels. So we do know that traditional gasoline, like you're saying, diesel and runoff fossil fuels, they're derived from fossil fuels. And I was wondering, has there been any sustainable innovations in manufacturing rocket fuels, such as possibly harvesting energy from the sun, such as solar power, or is there an alternative that has been looking into development for rocket fuels?
I am so glad you mentioned that. It has been looked at, but sadly, well, let's look at the positive. The positive is that the sun is out there. It's going to provide sustainable energy for various transportation needs. It's just going to do that. The challenge is harvesting enough of that in order to travel for long distances. So we can do it, but for distances as far as going to the moon, unfortunately, it's going to conk out. It's just not sustainable. And then once you get out of the Earth's atmosphere and you have less sunlight, what are you going to do then? So we think about that. And we also say, let's say hydrogen, for instance, it's called H2. It's a diatomic molecule. Ooh, we need so much of that in comparison to fossil fuels. And let's just think about our car and our tank, maybe 15 gallons tank in our car. and it's using fossil fuels, for instance. If we were to try to switch to a different fuel, we can, but imagine our car being maybe 4 times its size. In order to do that, we're not quite ready for that. In order to store the fuel, I think that's the challenge. The challenge is in some cases we can use alternative fuels, but the challenge is that storage. Are we willing to build something 4 times the size? Keep in mind that to do that, it's almost like a ever-ending wheel of, okay, yeah, we can do it, but we have to double the size of the vehicle. You double the size of the vehicle, you have to add more fuel. And it's an ongoing cycle of fossil fuel happens to be the best, which leads me to the next slide. So how did I end up at Chevron? Well, I have to share with you this kind of conundrum that happened. So I kept coming back for about 6 summers. Imagine a summer position, 6 summers. Most teenagers are only at a place for a summer, right? 3 years, but I came back 6 times. So on my 6th time coming in, of course, everyone knew me, the security knew me and everyone knew me. But my boss came out this time. They didn't let me in at first. They said, okay, hi, Allison, lovely seeing you. However, due to budget cuts, your position will not be continued. But keep in mind that I was only a summer and temporary employee. It wasn't a permanent position for me. It was a wonderful experience for me. And I learned so much. So it was really a good thing that I had that experience, because it actually led me to a job at Chevron oil refinery. So during my time at NASA and thinking about fossil fuels, I was able to go right in to working as a chemical engineer. So chemical engineering technician, initially though in equipment inspection, and then ultimately I landed a position as a chemical engineer technician in what's called the planning and analytical division. I wonder, planning and analytical, what do you do there? So these are some of the questions that I was tasked to answer. How much fossil fuel comes from Alaska? I use Alaska as one example because that's within the contiguous US. But we pulled fossil fuels, of course, from Louisiana, from Saudi Arabia, from India, from all over the world. I'd like you to think about something for a moment. Think about ice cream. And when you go to the grocery store, you'll see several brands of ice cream. For some of you, you'll say, I really like the flavor of this ice cream because it tastes a little more creamy. And others say, I like this ice cream because it tastes light. It doesn't have as much cream. I like this ice cream because it's sweeter. I like this ice cream because it offers maybe a variety of extra items like candy pieces or chunks of chocolate or other things like that. So we all have our goals in eating our ice cream. So it's the same thing with goals in looking at fossil fuels for various petroleum products. Some petroleum products like gasoline need things from that Alaska provides. Some fossil fuels from Saudi Arabia are used for basic petroleum products like Vaseline, for instance, or things that are used in the medical industry. And others from, let's say, Louisiana are known for jet fuels, so maybe jet fuels. And each of those 3 petroleum products comes with a price. So what I had to do in planning analytical, knowing the chemistry behind it, and also understanding a little bit more about costs, because I learned a little bit about finances as well. I was part of a team that negotiated price with the various entities of fossil fuels and fossil fuels that came in. On one end, the intake of the fossil fuels, on the other end, the outtake. So Chevron USA or Chevron oil refinery also took the fossil fuels in, processed them, in other words, distilled them and sold them. And of selling them, of course, it's, you know, they mark their price up and get a certain percentage out there. And of course, they sold fuels to the various jet industry, to NASA, to a variety of complex industries that needed petroleum products, refined petroleum products. So that's what I worked with. And then one of the other big questions that I asked, or I had to answer, was what is the demand for petroleum products? Jet fuel, gasoline, rocket fuel like kerosene. And kerosene, by the way, was the main product that's used for the rocket fuels. It's a kerosene product. You may have heard of kerosene. In the old days, kerosene lamps were used. If you watch any old Western movies, and they take a lamp and they light it, that's kerosene that's used. And kerosene is still used around the world.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I enjoyed how you talked about all the different places that we draw fossil fuels from. And I think it might be new information to some students, but we don't get all the gasoline that we use from our country. And I was wondering if you had the information, where does most of our gasoline come from for our cars?
It depends on the refinery. So I would say that in Southern California, I want to say it varies based on the market. That's a better answer. It's based on the market. Maybe perhaps in the springtime, it could be Alaska, because they are up and running in springtime and they want to get rid of their fuel. So there might be a better cost dynamics for them. And so with that, more fuels come from local. I say local, but contiguous USA, to get rid of our fuels first. And then maybe in the wintertime, the international fuels might be better.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And next, we'll go into your piece about the environment.
Yes, of course. So in my work at NASA as well as Chevron, of course, I started thinking about, you know, at some point, these natural resources are going to be depleted, aren't they? At some point, you know, so I thought about that, and it kind of drew me to thinking, because I had I literally hands-on with fossil fuels. I literally controlled what fossil fuels would be distilled at an oil refinery. I felt that was very, very powerful. I couldn't help but think at some point we have to realize that these fossil fuels will be depleted. These natural resources are going to go somewhere. As a proponent of environmental issues, we have to recognize we cannot, at least with our time here on Earth, commit ourselves to every single component. At one point, I thought about paper. I sure did. I thought about, because I used the computers at Chevron, we had all these printouts that we had to do, strategic planning, use a lot of paper. And of course, I recycled the paper because that's made from wood. And of course, in order to get the paper, we had to chop down trees and then we had to replant trees. I didn't want to take that on. I thought about the fossil fuels more so, I think, than wood. Of course, you think about water as well, conserving water, but I kind of took that on. And some of the things that I thought about was, how much longer will we be able to sustain gasoline fueled cars? How much longer? And I think our world is actually leaning more toward and being more comfortable with the idea of electric vehicles. So I'm so happy about that. Another question I asked was, how much longer will we be able to heat our homes with natural gas? Now, one of the things I talk about a lot, because some say, well, I don't have a home with natural gas. I have a home with electricity. Well, think about how that electricity was created, by burning natural gas. So we have to kind of remember there is a little bit more to natural gas than just having see it directly in our homes. And another question, how much longer will we be able to rely on national or international fossil fuel production? We have been very fortunate in recent years, at least through my lifetime. Thankfully, our government has protected us from wars, from war zones. I mean, there are economic wars that are happening all the time, but we don't want to be in a position as a nation to have to fight a lot for things. So I say that to ask, Can we sustain ourselves with our natural fuel sources? Well, think about fossil fuels for a moment. Fossil fuels come from former organic products. And what do I mean by former organic products? Former living things, such as plants, animals, and even humans. We're not speaking about recent, we're speaking about years and years and years ago. So even though we might have enough fossil fuels within my lifetime and your lifetime, I think about the bigger picture and say, in 1,000 years, in 100 years, what little thing can I do now to create a more sustainable one for which we're not just dependent upon fossil fuels within our nation and not just international as well? Because if we, in a worst case scenario, run out of our national fossil fuels, we are going to therefore be dependent upon international fossil fuels. And if there's not a friendly communication or collaboration, then we may be in a little bit of trouble.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for sharing once again. And I like how you mentioned how we're starting to move towards electric vehicles. And personally, I've been seeing a lot more on the road, which makes me very happy as well. And my question to you is, what steps do we need to make as a country to better implement electric vehicles, to get more of them on the road and start replacing cars that rely on fossil fuels?
Well, one of the bigger steps is to actually make a paradigm shift within a home. And that is preparing your home by changing the electrical input from the electric company to be able to support electric vehicles away from fossil fuels. In other words, newer homes, if they are built to hold the power that is needed for electric vehicles, if all new homes are built with that power supply, it's going to make a bigger difference in people who buy new homes, because they'll say, oh, I already have a place where I can plug in my electric vehicle. And if you're in a home that is not brand new, encourage your parents to have the electrical outlet to support an electric vehicle. Once you do that, you'll start recognizing, I've got to use that plug. I've taken the time to build it. I have to use that plug. So then you start looking at either a hybrid vehicle or just go full force and get one that is fully electric.
Great. Thank you for sharing. And next, we'll go into your time as a science educator.
Okay. So in my work at Chevron, of course, I absolutely loved it. The opportunity came up to teach. And I thought, oh, I have a lot to tell about the environment. And look, I've worked at NASA, I've worked at Chevron. I think I could be a great teacher. At the time at Los Angeles, there was an opening for a science teacher. And I thought, oh, I can do this. This will be wonderful. So I applied and went in right away. There were actually two paths to go in. One path is to be paired up with what's called a veteran teacher, and to work alongside the veteran teacher for a while. And then in a year, you hired in as a full-time teacher. The other path is to go in as an intern. And you've heard of the word intern. Well, as an intern teacher, the best words to explain is sink or swim or fight or flight. So in other words, I got hired on a Friday. I went into a classroom on a Monday. I had 150 students and I went right in. I taught advanced placement chemistry, honors chemistry, physics, physical science, environmental science, mathematics. I taught all of these courses in high school, ultimately middle school, and administration. I enjoyed teaching. It was absolutely fabulous. I love teaching, and I still love teaching. And some ask, do I like that better than working at NASA? I think NASA was very exciting for me I really loved it. I really loved learning about the chemistry part and understanding the mechanics of fossil fuels and just the idea of combustion and all the different things that happen with combustion. I also enjoyed working at Chevron quite a bit, but I think I liked most was connecting with students and changing their lives and changing young lives.
Awesome. Yeah. And my question to you is, it sounds like you're very, very passionate about teaching. And I was just wondering, what was your favorite subject to teach?
Do I have to choose?
Maybe top two, top three.
Oh boy.
Or do all the subjects get equal love from you?
Probably all get equal love. I can share what I liked about each of the subjects. I can do that.
Okay.
Advanced placement chemistry was interesting because what that allowed students to do was get dual credit. So they got credit at the high school and they got credit after taking what's called the advanced placement exam. That was very exciting for me because I helped students get double credit. So they got college credit while taking my class. Honors chemistry class was similar. They had the opportunity to take advanced placement. But what I liked was that I could teach them some of the same laboratory work that I did at UCLA and that I did at NASA. So those parts were very exciting for me. Physics and physical science, they both have physics in them. So I would say the best part about teaching those courses was, well, let's say in physics, I had my students actually create one of my favorite hobbies, which was roller coasters. So I had my students create roller coasters. Yes. Well, classroom size roller coasters, and they were awesome. And in physical science, I would say my big project there was having students think about the future and creating a model size home or city of the future. So that was like a fantastic project for that. Environmental science and biology, I'll put those two together. Actually, environmental science, biology, and earth science, I did a lot of work outside. And one of my most fascinating projects was called Fast Plants. And Fast Plants actually took students through cycle of from the seed all the way to creating the buds and creating the flower back to the seed again over a shorter period of time, like 12 weeks. Oh, also, I want to go back to chemistry just a little bit. I had my students create their own mineral. And what I mean by their own mineral is they created a size mineral about this size. You can see about this size. And they could actually string it around their neck. So they actually created a crystal. Thanks to my work, of course, at NASA and Chevron, I was able to put together that and create an assignment for them to do that. And mathematics, just really kind of studying the way to calculate force and speed and calculus. There's a lot of calculus behind physics. And so I connected them with that as well. And those are my top. So that's why I liked all of them. When I talk about having a passion for teaching, can't play favorites. They were all, I had exceptional experiences in all of those.
Totally understandable. I really wish I had you as a teacher back in high school or middle school. But yeah, thank you for sharing that. And next we'll go into your work as a school district administrator.
Okay, sure. Well, I guess my talents were seen and I was pulled out of the classroom into a bigger role. And that bigger role was a school district administrator. So you might wonder, how is that different from being a teacher? Not a big difference, except I work directly with science and math teachers. So I loved how I could go into classrooms and actually work directly with the teachers and help train them on all the fascinating things that I could do as a teacher. Also, I was helpful in recommending science and math supplies, including lab equipment. One fascinating element was that schools across a district oftentimes had increased enrollment. And so when they had increased enrollment, they needed to add more classroom space. So one easy way to add classroom space was to add a bungalow. And so part of my role was when a new bungalow was added, and it was a science bungalow, that I was instrumental in identifying what equipment needed to be placed in there. and how the desk should be arranged and all the other fun things, where the bulletin board should be, where the sink should be, where the lab station wash would be. And so that was really, really fun. I was able to actually recommend textbooks. I thought that was very empowering because I'm able to go through the text and recognize this is appropriate for the students to learn, this is not appropriate. This has great tools for math teachers, great tools for science teachers. So working directly with what's called the California Department of Education, it empowered me to help set policies for teaching science and math. I absolutely loved that role as well as a school district administrator.
Next, we'll go into your piece about science fairs.
Okay, absolutely. So still working in a district office. And by the way, my district office work led me back to the classroom. And I was able to support teachers as well as students. But this time I actually supported some students of mine. I had a chemistry student who won first place at the Los Angeles County Science Fair. And the judges asked him, they said, who's your science teacher? I heard them asking that. And then they walked over and they introduced herself and they said, you're his science teacher? I said, yes, I'm his science teacher. They said, have you ever thought of teaching in higher education? And I thought, well, yes, I did. I did think about teaching in higher education. So that led me to my current work as a consultant, supervisor, designer, teacher, science advocate. I am a university professor. My first teaching job as a university professor was teaching organic chemistry at California State University, Los Angeles. I'll never forget that first day. It was really a natural for me to be now in front of folks who were adults, young adults, and they were really fascinated about organic chemistry. And I absolutely, absolutely loved it. And ultimately, I worked as a consultant because of my background. I could work with districts, I could work with schools, I could work as a science fair judge. I worked in some technology as well. And I guess my biggest skill, and one of the things I like working with, is those that are obtaining their bachelor's of science and master's of science degrees or doctoral degrees and their credentials to become math and science teachers, and actually elementary teachers as well.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for sharing. And my question to you was, you had similar roles, but one was in higher education, one was in grade school. And what were the main changes you had to make, or what were the main differences between those positions?
So are you referring to teaching or?
In your administrating role, as well as teaching too.
Some of the bigger differences, I would say the university, because some universities offer online elements, I think I was able to work with a much bigger audience in the university administration than at the district and elementary level. So with a bigger audience, I felt bigger stakes, higher stakes, and a larger range of a population. So I had many people that were in their 20s and people that were much older. I will say that my most memorable student was one in which I taught chemistry at a community college, at El Camino College. And he was about 80 years old. And a little funny story with him is that the periodic table that has over 100 elements, of which about 3/4 of them are naturally occurring, the other 4th are man-made. He asked me a question about an element, a particular element, and I thought for some reason he was joking with me. And I thought, no, of course that element exists. Yes, we use it, in various parts of our homes. And then when he told me his age, I almost like I hit myself over the head. And I said, no wonder he's asking that. That element wasn't discovered during his high school years. It was discovered after high school. And if he hadn't taken any college courses from high school till now, he didn't know about that element. So it's really fascinating that I touch so many lives and a wide range of lives that I touch. And it tells me that I have to really be cognizant of where people come from and what their background is, because things will change in science and they don't really understand these changes that can happen, especially if you miss school. And if you miss school for that amount of time that he missed school for, yes, he didn't know about these other elements that were existing. So really funny story that I think about.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that story. And we'll move right along into your educational pathway.
Okay. Well, I am a UCLA Bruin, having attained my Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry and mathematics. Remember earlier I talked about at NASA, and when they asked me, what do you want to be? And I said, I want to find a cure for my mother's disease. Well, sadly, fortunately, my mother did pass away, and I actually changed my field. I started off as a pre-pharmacy major at UCLA. I did actually get into 2 universities. I only applied to 2, and luckily I got into both universities. I applied to USC and to UCLA. I got into USC on a full ride for pharmacy. But I think after, when my mother passed away, I kind of shifted my thoughts. I was pre-pharmacy at UCLA, but I switched to chemistry and mathematics. So I went that route. I could still go into pharmacy school. I also, at the time, while I was working at NASA, I attended UCLA. I was kind of leaning less toward the pharmacy route and more toward the what's called physical science route. So less of the life sciences that dealt with life and more of the physical sciences that dealt with speed and motion. I ultimately obtained a Master's of Arts degree in kind of a triple. They no longer offer this, but at the time they did. It was a triple. So psychology, early childhood, and technology, because I didn't know which direction I wanted to go in. I liked the technology, but they offered it with early childhood. And I said, well, maybe one day. And then psychology, I don't think we could ever learn enough about the study of the mind. Ultimately, I got a second master's in science in administration, and that helped attune my thoughts as a university administrator as well as district level administrator. I did go for a PhD in organic chemistry. I did go for that. And then I said, I'm raising a family. I want to be attuned to my time. And I switched to a doctoral degree in educational leadership because I said, well, shall I go into actually teaching more organic chemistry? Or since I have been working in the educational realm for so long, which route should I go? So I really was weighing PhD in organic chemistry. I can go the route of teaching organic chemistry, for which I started at Cal State University in Los Angeles. Or do I go the teacher route? And I think the teacher route kind of weighed a little bit more. I still have my coursework for organic chemistry in the doctoral level. So technically I could still teach some courses in that, but mainly I do teach educational leadership and other doctoral courses.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. No questions for me, just a very extensive educational background that you have. And next we'll go into some things you had to learn to get where you are today.
Oh, so many lessons. And there's not enough time in a day to explain each of them. But I think the top 4 are these. Everyone has a talent. You need to find yours and capitalize on it. I was not outgoing at all in high school, elementary school, and elementary school. In fact, in middle school, I was profoundly shy. And that is actually a clinical term, to be profoundly shy. What that means is that you literally don't utter a word in public because of whatever, conditions. You're either scared or you're not confident. And I think mainly I was scared and lacked confidence. And there was a lot of concern about that. And I think partly it was because I didn't find myself. And I think a lot of times as teenagers, as elementary kids, as high schoolers, you don't quite know, or you're not cultivated in a way to find what's good for you. Sometimes others influence you and say, hey, I can play basketball, you can too. Or I can roller skate, you can too. Without you being the leader and saying, no, I can draw really well. That's what I can do. And so find what makes you smile and capitalize on it. It could be something as simple as drawing, for which you help somebody younger than you to do that as well. It could be something like basketball. It could be something like sports. It could be something for which no one sees but you, such as studying really hard. Did you know that that's a talent as well? You can tap in on that. You can help your friends study real hard too. But you definitely want to think about a subject that you like as well, because that's going to define what you will study in college. It's never too early to start thinking about it, nor is it ever too late to make your dream a reality. There's not someone that's too young to fulfill a dream or someone too old to fulfill a dream. It's all about perspective. If you have a dream, for instance, of being a concert pianist, you may never have had any training of being a concert pianist, no training at all, but basic hard work and learning how to play a singular song. Well, with the internet, you can post yourself playing that song and therefore dub yourself as being a concert pianist. It's all about perspective. You can invite your friends. You can have a big gathering remotely for people to watch you, and you can dress up and have a big to do about it. So always think about what you want to do, because you never want to ever feel regret for not having done it. And never put anyone down, because you never know when you may need them to build you up. I always take leverage in saying my students come as they are, old, young, without abilities, and then always be yourself and go for your dreams. And I want to just share a story about a student that I had. As I mentioned, in the district level administration, you have the limits within that school, but at university, you actually have no limits, because many schools, universities have online teaching and online learning opportunities. And I want to share a story about one of my most memorable students. He was an adult learner who was obtaining his English degree. And because of my many disciplines that I've taught and studied, I'm able to teach English courses. So I taught an undergrad course, a Bachelor's of Science degree in English course, to a student who was quadriplegic. Quadriplegic means he had no use of arms and no use of his legs. He was a high functioning quadriplegic in that he was able to speak for 2 hours a day. Sometimes, and by the way, his story is that he was a young man in a bicycle accident, unfortunately, and therefore he severed his spinal cord. So he knew how to speak, he knew how to write, he knew all these things, but was not able to anymore physically do that. And with the level of spinal injury, it prevented him from breathing on his own. He got to a point where he could breathe on his own for 2 hours a day. And those 2 hours a day were labored a little bit because it took a lot of his muscles to breathe. So I say that because he was able to type out his paper using a software system. There's many software systems for which you could speak into the microphone and it wrote for you. And also he was a second language learner. So he actually spoke Arabic as his first language and English was his second language. He was memorable because he always thanked me for taking the time to teach him. He and I were quite close growing up through the course, and then we kind of lost contact. And this was in 2012. I'll never forget him. He ultimately did get his degree, but imagine speaking every word for your 5-page essay through a microphone. It took a very long time for him to do it, but he did get his degree. And now he is a public speaker. His goal, though, was to be an English teacher in his country. Even though he didn't realize that goal, he did realize the goal of being a public speaker. So in his goal of being a public speaker, he's able to influence others to speak English. So in a way, a circumvented way, if you look at his perspective, he did reach his goal.
Awesome. Yeah, that was a great story. And thank you for sharing. And one thing that you mentioned earlier was always trying to find your passion, the subject that you're passionate about, because it'll drive you for the rest of your life in your college career and then into your professional career. And I was wondering, for students out there who are having trouble finding that one subject that really drives them, or maybe they've been trying a lot of subjects but aren't really getting into it, what advice do you have for them to persevere, to keep trying, and to keep pursuing?
Absolutely never give up. Always think about those words. I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to give up. Because your dreams will be a reality if you take on the right perspective.
Awesome. Thank you for those wise words.
Mhm.
And next, we'll go into some advice you can offer our students.
Absolutely. Think about the future. What do you think life will be like in 30 years? Remember, that was one of the questions I always challenge my physical science students with. And that picture there, that graphic there, identifies an example of some of the various ways for which they thought of the future. Some thought it would be an underwater lifestyle, and some thought it would be on on the moon, and some thought it would be underground under the earth. So think about what life will be like in 30 years. What are your talents, and how can you strengthen them? So beyond identifying them, now the bigger challenge is, how do you strengthen them? So one important element is, how do you strengthen them? And then lastly, who do you want to be your mentor? I think it's very important to recognize that some dreams need a little help, and it's not going to hurt you to be supported by someone. So think about who could be your mentor. It could be someone that you know. It could be somebody that you've reached out to. And with the internet, you can reach out to people in a safe way, but do make sure that your parents are involved. Absolutely 100% that your parents are involved.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you for this great advice. I think it's so important to ask ourselves these monumental questions into what will propel us forward in our lives. But yeah, we'll move on to our last section. I've been asking questions throughout, so I just have two questions for you here. The first being, in any of your positions at NASA, in school administration, or Chevron, was there ever a point in time where you had a sort of disagreement with a colleague or coworker, or a differing opinion or view, and how did you work through that?
Actually, that will always be ongoing. So beyond NASA and Chevron, and even in teaching and district, as well as the university administration, there will always be some type of conflict. I would say that in whatever position that you're in, and whatever level that you're in, whether it be in management, supervision, or working for someone else and directly under someone else, always think of what the bigger goal is for that department. As a teacher, the bigger goal is, how will this benefit students? So will this decision benefit students? And when there is a conflict, I ask the other person, do you think that that will benefit the student? And if they have an argument for saying that that will benefit the student, then I will agree with it. Because if they feel that that's a goal and it benefits students, then I'm in agreement with that as well. At Chevron and NASA, what it came down to essentially, for those running on a budget, does that fulfill the budgetary constraints for our department? And I would ask the same question, does it fulfill the budgetary constraints? And if it did, then I say go for it. Then that's the solution that we have. And that's really how you have to address conflicts, is you look at the common goal. And for me, I always look at the bigger picture. I don't put myself into it. I say, this decision is really beyond me. I want to go for the greater good. And whatever the greater good is, I'm willing to be flexible for that.
Awesome. Yeah, I love how you put importance on self-sacrifice for the betterment of the whole. And my last question for you today is, I think it's a misconception for young people to think once they get a job, they have to know everything and have all the skills for that job. And I love how when you're talking about NASA, you got onboarded and they said, oh, you'll be working in science and mathematics. And you said, oh, I'm not quite sure what that means. It's apparent that once we get a job, we're still learning while we're on the job. And my question is, what is the most valuable or your favorite skill or thing that you learned while on a job?
There are so many skills that you can learn, but I think beyond the what's called hard skills that you learn, for instance, in mathematics or engineering, even in engineering, there's a lot of calculations, there's a lot of formulas. And if you get one segment wrong on that formula, it's going to give you an error on your calculation. So beyond the hard skills of recognizing the details, all of the details that need to be there, the signs, the exclamation marks or the power buttons, beyond the balancing of the equations for chemistry, beyond the units that are needed for physics, and beyond the life science biology elements that you have to recognize for cleanliness and making sure that organic substances are kept away from building bacteria, is learning about soft skills. And that is a newer term to learn and understand. We are not isolated in this world. We have to work with others for the greater good of mankind. So learning more about yourself, what makes you tick and what makes others tick, that psychology element, remember I studied some psychology, learning about how you get along with others will make a remarkable difference in your elevation in your jobs. I think there are a lot of people, and over time, you're going to master all the hard skills in the world. But for you to be promoted and for you to be recognized as an expert in your area beyond your hard skills is to actually have what's called people skills or soft skills, and learning how to project and help others build their skills, I think is primary for you as a lesson to learn.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. Well, that wraps up the interview. I just want to take this time to give out a huge, huge thank you to Allison for coming on this webinar and sharing about your educational and career pathway.
Absolutely. It's a tremendous blessing to share this important element about STEM and how it led me to where I am today. I wouldn't be where I am today without thinking about my goals at an earlier age and actually acting upon them. So reach out to others and tell them about this story, and hopefully that will influence them to live their dreams.
Awesome. Yeah. And I also want to take this time to give a huge thank you to everyone watching. If you want to see more interviews like this one, you can visit our YouTube channel, The Energy Coalition, or you can go to peakstudents.org to view our full library.